Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. In a time, with AI porn and people pandering to the basest instincts of the American public, even a podcast like this cannot resist such sort of naked financial inducements and the appeal for popularity. And that's why we're going to do a deep dive on Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren, as you may know, was the first president to be born after the Declaration of Independence. And we have literally the greatest living biographer of Martin Van Buren on here today, James Bradley. He's done a lot of journalism. He helps run, I don't want to get into his full bio, but his new book is Martin Van Buren, America's First Politician. It was put out by Oxford University Press in 2024. James, welcome to the Remnant.
Thank you, Jonah. Great to be with you.
So, as you were warned, first question out of the box. What's your book about? And I guess maybe explain the subtitle in the course of explaining what your book is about.
In one sentence, my book is about how the son of a tavern keeper became president of the United States. That's a key part of this book because Van Buren's rise is highly unusual. It was highly unusual then. It's still unusual now in that he didn't have all of the advantages that so many other politicians had who rose to the levels that he did. I use that subtitle, America's First Politician, with some trepidation because any time you start using a superlative like first, Weisenheimers are going to jump in and say, well, what do you mean? There were politicians before him. Yes, there were, but there were never any quite like Martin Van Buren. Very few people at the time embraced this term. It was something they would use sheepishly to sort of say, yeah, we occasionally engage in politics, but we're really public servants. Van Buren was somebody who really embraced this title. He saw politics not just as a means of winning elections, but as a way of furthering democracy, as a way of connecting to citizens, as a way of strengthening America's democracy. And he was the first to articulate this vision of a party, of a mass political party that would have a personality, would have a vision, would embrace a set of values. And of course, all of this was designed to connect with voters and to ensure its survival, because the reason the party system was in such flux before them, because they weren't really professionals. They would get together, they would band together to fight a certain cause or a certain issue, and then they would kind of go their separate ways. But Van Buren, more than anybody else, he wasn't the only one, but he was the first politician at that time to really say that a political party has to be a permanent presence in America's political life. He was the first to really articulate this and to embrace this. So that's why I chose that subtitle for the book.
Yeah, I mean, I'm particularly interested in the party stuff, and which is fortunate because that's his major contribution. We should sort of clarify for folks. I think it's Edmund Burke the word goes back to ancient Rome, but it's Edmund Burke who first started to talk about political parties. But even back then, as you were saying, they're more like factions,
right?
Cliques, right? It's sort of like when we talk today, you can still hear it a little bit in the echoes when people say, "Oh, the war party." You don't necessarily mean the Republicans or this, but you mean the people in favor of war or that kind of thing. And so there were kind of parties, right? There was anti-federalists and federalists.
They would say things like the Friends of Mr. Jefferson, the Friends of Mr. Hamilton, because of course that's what historians now call the first party system. It's the party wars that started in the 1790s, and it was brought about because of the controversy over Alexander Hamilton's economic policies. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were the leaders, and of course, they were called factions. And because James Madison was somebody who railed against factions when he was writing the Federalist Papers. This was another parlor game they all liked to do. When they were out of power, they said how terrible parties were. When they were in power, they said, okay, well, parties have their uses, but we're not going to make too much of this. It's not going to be a permanent part of our lives. And I know Van Buren called this a species of cant, which I've always liked.
So you say in the subtitle that he's the first politician, and I take what you mean by that, but in some ways, couldn't you say he was more like a? I mean, it seems to me he's in some ways more of a tinkerer or a reformer in the sense that he takes. When you say he's the first politician, people hear, "Oh, he's the first glad-hander," which obviously he wasn't. He's the first one to take the craft of politics as politics kind of seriously, and or again, but I guess the point is the other person who sort of thinks like he does, as a person who proposes mechanisms for organizing our politics, is really Madison, at least from that era.
I would say Aaron Burr is the better prototype.
Okay.
And he learned a lot from Aaron Burr, remember.
So what did he learn from Aaron Burr that he didn't learn from Madison?
Well, let's go back a little bit. So Van Buren is born in upstate New York in 1782. He is the first president who was born after independence. Sovereignty was actually officially declared days before he was born. And he has a number of good breaks early in his career. And one is that a cousin of his and a neighbor, a man named William Peter Van Ness, and his brother John Peter Van Ness, they are very close associates of Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr is based in New York City right at the time. And the Van Ness family, they are down in New York City, but they're also still in upstate New York. So Aaron Burr is building these connections throughout building this network of allies in New York. And William Peter Van Ness becomes one of his closest associates, and they recognize Martin Van Buren's talents. So William Peter Van Ness is a lawyer in New York City, and Van Buren starts clerking for him when Martin Van Buren plays a big role in electing his brother, John P. Van Ness, I know this can get confusing, stick with me here, to Congress in 1800. So Van Buren has this great opportunity. He doesn't go to college. He does not have a college education. He doesn't come from a powerful landed family in upstate New York, like the Van Rensselaers and the Livingstons and the Schuylers, but they recognize his talents early on. And he goes down to New York, and this is where Aaron Burr is based. And Aaron Burr in 1800 plays this formative role in electing Thomas Jefferson. Now, Aaron Burr is the vice president. He was on the presidential ticket, even though they weren't really tickets back then. They were like tickets. In New York City, Martin Van Buren gets this great political education from Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr teaches him how to organize really on the granular level. And he takes all of these things that he learns from Burr, which Burr had spent decades cultivating, going back to the Revolution, about how to organize, how to canvass, all of these various facets of what they called electioneering back then, which were things that candidates themselves were not supposed to do, is what your operatives were supposed to do. So Van Buren really gets this incredible education from the vice president of the United States, who's on the outs with his president because of the controversial manner in which the election of 1800, which dragged on because it was a tie because of the peculiarities of the Electoral College. Everyone thought it wouldn't drag out, but it did drag out in the House of Representatives. At the 11th hour, Jefferson is named the third president of the United States. But there's all this bad blood between Aaron Burr and Jefferson over the way that whole thing unfolded. So Burr is on the outs, but nevertheless, he's still there, and Van Buren learns a great deal from him. So that sort of political education is what brings him to this whole new level of a political mastermind that he would use throughout the next few decades in his career.
So the era of good feelings is sort of the American version of the Holy Roman Empire, because it wasn't. Can you sort of explain what it was and how Martin Van Buren's thinking about parties comes out of that craziness?
I want to go back for just one moment, because we're talking about Madison, we're talking about Burr, sure, but we're not talking about the person who's his real hero, his real intellectual hero, and that's Thomas Jefferson. And this cannot be overemphasized, that there was a reason why they were called Jeffersonians. They really saw Thomas Jefferson as their guiding light, as their North Star, as their somebody who, represented everything that America should be politically. That he was this man of great learning and sophistication, but at the same time, he articulated this vision for America, a land of farmers and tradesmen and artisans, and then it was not the Hamiltonian version of a land of bankers and Congregationalists and Freemasons, the people they associated with the elite clubs that they were not part of. So it's the Jeffersonian. I mean, he admires Madison. Don't get me wrong, but Jefferson, I think, is the real hero to him, who articulates this vision that he and a lot of people like him really latch onto. Now, the 1824 election is this enormous event in early U.S. history that I don't think gets nearly as much attention as it should. So I'm grateful that you bring it up here. We're in the era of good feelings, which, as you point out, is largely a myth. There was a term coined by a Boston newspaper editor because it seemed to be a time when party strife was at a very low ebb, that the Federalist Party was discredited after its conduct during the War of 1812, when it flirted with this idea of joining forces with England and breaking, that New England would actually secede and break apart and become its own country and form an alliance. These were ideas talked about in what the Hartford Convention was from that period. So the Federalist Party was spent by then. So what did we have? We had one party. They were all calling themselves Jeffersonians, but they were obviously split. So they said they were one party, but they were one party with several factions. I mean, any party that could have John Quincy Adams and John C. Calhoun in it really wasn't much of a party right there. So you've got 5 people running for president in 1824. You've got John Quincy Adams, you've got Andrew Jackson, you've got Henry Clay, you've got John C. Calhoun, although he drops out by November, and you've got William Harris Crawford. They all represent not only different ideologies to some degree, but they're all in different parts of the country. John Quincy Adams is in New England. Andrew Jackson is in Tennessee, kind of straddles the West and the South. Henry Clay is Kentucky, very much of the West. You've got Calhoun is in South Carolina. You've got Crawford in Georgia. So you've got the South, Middle South, you've got West, Southwest, and you've got New England. Obviously, no one's going to get a majority of the electoral votes when you've got this many candidates representing different ideologies, representing different parts of the country. Naturally, the race goes into the House of Representatives. Andrew Jackson gets
we should just explain to people the way it works is if you don't win an outright majority of electoral college, it gets thrown to the House, and then each state votes as a state.
That's right. That's right. So every state has its own delegation. So if there are nine congressmen from that state, if it's 5-4 for a candidate, all of that state's electoral votes go to that candidate. Now, we had been through this before in 1800. That was very controversial. That was tumultuous. 1824 was much worse because Andrew Jackson did not get a majority of the electoral votes, but he got a plurality. And a plurality of the popular votes, although we have to throw in a caveat with that several states, especially New York, the largest state in the country, still did not choose presidential electors through popular vote. They did it through the state legislatures. So had all the states had the popular vote, it's possible that John Quincy Adams would have had a plurality. But still, at the time, Jackson did. So Jackson thought he was the natural victor. Jackson thought the House should support him for president. But the House had a very different view on this. They said, it's a new election now. Okay, the voters had their say, and now we get ours. They went with John Quincy Adams. Henry Clay got behind John Quincy Adams, which made sense on every level. Ideologically, the two were very much aligned, much more than with a figure like Crawford, who was Van Buren's choice. So the fallout from the 1824 election, in which John Quincy Adams is named the sixth president of the United States, even though didn't get a plurality of the popular votes, is something that really dogged Adams and it dogged Henry Clay, because there was this idea that you two struck a deal to make Adams president. And Henry Clay was just thinking, well, I prefer Adams. Naturally, I would support him. But Jackson and his people said they cut a deal that in order to get Clay's support, Clay would become Secretary of State, which is what happened. Now, Adams is just thinking, well, I'm bringing a former adversary into my cabinet. I'm trying to be a seasoned moderate statesman here, trying to bring what we now call the team of rivals together. He wanted Jackson part of his administration too, but Jackson said no. So Van Buren sees the fallout from the 1824 election as something that's going to be a very destructive force in American life. Like, what are we going to do if we've got lots of factions, people running for president, that's going to go to the House on a regular basis? What kind of democracy are we really going to have here? So it's from that he changes his views on a number of things, changes his views on Andrew Jackson, and changes his views on what role a party should play in American life. He was determined that America would never have a presidential election go to the House of Representatives. And we have to say he did it, because we haven't gone there ever since. And it was something that many at the time thought was going to be a regular occurrence.
Yeah, so I seem to recall, so one of the things I think is useful about thinking about the era of good feelings is, in terms of all this stuff, is that, he has that line somewhere in his autobiography where he says, the Federalist faction never went away, it just changed labels or whatever, right?
Yes.
It's this idea that, which it's sort of why I wanted to get to the Madison part, because Madison kind of changed his views on, like all the founders, they hated parties, and all that kind of stuff. But Madison came to be more supportive because he understood that which is weird that what I find weird is this inherent tension, which is that the whole founding is based on this idea of pitting faction against faction, of not only checks and balances horizontally but vertically, right? It's each state has divided power, separated powers, and to think that parties would not play a role in that seems like such a weird blind spot for the founders. And what I always took from Martin Van Buren about this was that he looks at the era of good feelings and says, look, we're going to have these factions no matter what.
Right.
We might as well be honest about it. We might as well have some clarity and truth in labeling about it.
Right.
And
we might as well be good at it. Like
and if we're going to have it, our team should be better at it than their team, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And I think about that. We're going to stay with the history, but I think that in the contemporary political sense, in my day job, I'm a pundit, and there are all these people who blame parties for our divisiveness. And the reality is that they get the causality backwards.
Yeah.
We have parties because of the dividedness, and there's nothing wrong with dividedness, right? Like the worst run, most philosophically evil systems are one-party countries. You cannot have democracy unless you have two parties. And all these people who which is to say that democracy is about disagreement, not about agreement. And we teach kids to not have a healthy understanding of what democracy is actually for, which is to disagree well, right? It's not to say that we're going to have this kumbaya moment where everybody agrees and then the voice of the people will rise up and we'll have an era of good feelings, because you can't have an era of good feelings, because in a big continental diverse country, that's just not going to happen. So what you need to do is figure out how to have productive disagreement. And I think that it's part of Martin Van Buren's insight is that he notices how he realizes that parties help you hone your arguments, make arguments, have serious disagreements, rather than just make it about crappy, mean girls cafeteria kind of personality driven stuff. Not to say that stuff wasn't part of politics in the 19th century, but I think it's a real contribution that people, because they're taught to hate parties because they're taught to hate partisanship, don't really understand that you're never going to get partisanship out of politics because that's what democratic politics is.
And he got all of this from his training as a lawyer. And he was not an ordinary lawyer. He was a lawyer serving during an extraordinary period. This idea that you have your adversary in the courtroom, and when the trial ends, you shake hands and you go get a beer. He
Right.
really brought that ethos to politics. He was very adamant about we should not let political disagreements get in the way of personal relations. He had this profound belief in that politicians really must behave in a decorous manner, that there's this thing called the loyal opposition, that opposing the incumbent, whatever that may be, the incumbent governor, the incumbent mayor, or the incumbent president, it's not a form of treason. This was very big with him, that you can oppose the people in power, and it's not going to be tantamount to some sort of betrayal. So this was something he got learning in the courtrooms of upstate New York, where he was up against the Federalist attorneys, because that's how much the political factions of the day infested life in New York, that it reached the law profession where there was no such thing as an apolitical attorney. Everyone was, you were either going to be with the Federalist faction, in which case, you represented the big landowners, you represented the corporations, which were not anything like today, but they were there, and of course they had their attorneys on retainer as they do today. Or you were going to represent the tenants, the farmers, the artisans, the people from the more modest areas of life. So Van Buren learns this early on, and he really parlays this into a political career. And through it, he forms a more coherent political, ideology. Same sort of ethos that he brought to the law, he brought to politics as well, which is something a lot of politicians did at the time. But I think he did it much more successfully than the others. And he was, as you were pointing out, very adamant about that politics is something that we have to be skilled at. In order for us to get anywhere, we're going to have to win elections. If we're going to win elections, we have to be good at building this organization, and to stop with this nonsense that parties are somehow going to be a destructive force in American life, but we can find a way to integrate them into a way to American life that can have repercussions in other areas too. So that's sort of everything he tried to represent in his long career in American politics.
So was there a tension, given that, he had this view, as you put it, of the loyal opposition, that sort of politics should not become the personal, that you should have respect for democratic structures. Is there a tension between those views and really rising to prominence under Andrew Jackson, who, shall we say, was more contemptuous of formal limitations on his power? I mean, he was a believer in a sort of mandatory, plebiscitary democracy of a sort, but like forms, structures, not taking things personally, these are not things that we generally associate with Andrew Jackson.
No, we do not. So yes, there was a lot of tension, and it's an extraordinary story, their relationship. They were an odd couple in many ways. I mean, opposite in every way. They were opposite in appearance. You think of Jackson, who's very tall and thin, got this huge head of hair, and Van Buren's kind of short and bald. They're different in their personalities. Jackson has got this fiery temper, really blunt, always seeing enemies everywhere. Van Buren is much more restrained. There are very few examples of him losing his temper in public. He was all about discipline and self-control, and trying to move away from this idea that your opponents are also your enemies, which is, again, we go back to the beginning now. Jackson grew up in this very harsh environment where he lost his entire family in the American Revolution. He was beaten severely by the British. This is very hard scrabble upbringing in the raw frontier of the Waxhaws region of Tennessee. And then you have Martin Van Buren, whose father is a tavern keeper, but he's also the town clerk. And this tavern is used as a site for political meetings. It's a polling site. We actually have evidence of congressional races where people would hit this tavern as a polling site to vote for candidates. So Van Buren grows up witnessing representative democracy in action. He emerges from this with a much more hopeful attitude that there are alternatives to violence, that there are alternatives to this kind of Manichaean worldview of enemies and supporters. He uses this to change, to build into a political career. So they have this very different background. So Van Buren is always trying to get Jackson to calm down, to simmer down. And he realizes something, that Jackson's got these great gifts, and he could be a hothead for sure, but he also could display these kind of courtly gentleman of the old South kind of manners as well, that he was always trying to show that side to people as well. So that tension was there. And so Van Buren is so instrumental in Andrew Jackson's rise, because he's not only somebody who he helps elect him president in 1828, but in the early part of his administration, he's there as a sort of temporizing force to make sure things don't get out of hand in his administration. And Jackson, in turn, helps Van Buren because he kind of stiffens his spine a little bit. He says to him, I understand where you're coming with compromise and looking at things with more equanimity, but at the same time, you need to show a little more fire once in a while too. So they kind of balanced each other out in many ways.
So just, I know you wrote a book about Martin Van Buren and not about Andrew Jackson.
But I wrote a lot about Jackson in the book.
But it's unavoidable.
Yeah.
I was telling you before we started recording that I'm trying autodidactically to bone up on my 19th century American history, which I feel like I need a lot of remedial work on. And one of the things I had not really appreciated or had simply forgotten from 11th grade civics or whatever was that Andrew Jackson was fairly contemptuous of the rule of law before he was president, as the military governor in Louisiana or New Orleans. And he was a pretty crappy guy who promised slaves that he would reward them if they help him fight, and then they gave them back to their owners and all that. Do you think there was a time where, it was Democrats used to have the Jefferson-Jackson dinners because those were we got rid of those just a few years ago. But what do you think ultimately a historical verdict on Andrew Jackson should be? Was he a would-be populist dictator, Napoleon? Was his commitment to democracy purely self-serving? I mean, how do you think about Jackson?
I think of Jackson as a warrior by circumstances of birth, a warrior by circumstances of world events, of national events, and that he was somebody who never forgot that he saw the world as a brutal place, and he saw that force is the way you settle these matters. And whenever he felt cornered, and he felt it often when he was president of the United States, often his first instinct was to use force. It's a loaded question, Jonah, but it's a great question, of course, because it's so much of Andrew Jackson right now is in great flux, because for so long he was looked at as this hero, as this great progenitor of American democracy. And I can see where that's coming from. I mean, you see some aspects. I mean, the bank veto, whatever you think of his war against the Second Bank of the United States, and I think it was short-sighted and in the end counterproductive. He wrote about, in his veto message, he talked about this force of people in positions of power and wealth and privilege using their influence to tip the scales of government in their favor. No president had ever addressed the American people in this way before. No one expected the president to be someone you identify with. the presidents prior to him were either highly educated men, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, or Virginia aristocrats, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. These were not people that anybody identified with. Andrew Jackson was something different, and Martin Van Buren realizes this, and he finds a way to harness this voter enthusiasm for a man who they thought was a lot like him. People who thought Jackson was a lot like them. And he finds a way of using that voter enthusiasm for him to build a successful campaign and to build a successful presidency. And in the process, he's got this vision of moving the Indians out west. And this Indian removal campaign, which is one of the great stains on American history from this period, is something that he, more than anybody else, really engineers and makes sure that he carries it out. The idea that America is never going to be a successful nation as long as we have this native population that he sees as something interfering with. So there's a big political design here, and about how the Indian Removal Act is passed and carried out. Going back to the Indian Removal Act, it was something that was really central to his vision. So obviously, you cannot call somebody a great champion of democracy, given what his attitudes were towards America's native population at the time. So this is such a mixed legacy here in terms of slavery, in terms of the Indian Removal Act. But at the same time, there was this idea of a man of the people out there that it's been something that so many political handlers have ever tried to emulate ever since with Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, I mean, just so you know where my priors are, we haven't really. I'm very skeptical about populism, and I do not like populism. I was a conservative in good standing for a very long time, writing against populism, and then the GOP went very, very populist, and everyone all of a sudden was like, "Oh, you rhino cuck sellout! Why are you so against populism?" Which is awesome, and I was like, well, here are like the 35 things I've written over the last 20 years explaining why I don't like populism. A little populism, to me, I'm a poison is determined by the dose guy. So a little populism is fine, right? Brings passion to politics. The same way like a little nationalism is fine, brings a certain sense of social solidarity and commitment to the polity. But too much of any of these things, they go from being sort of having a medicinal value to actually being poisonous. And Jackson, it feels to me, is the guy who introduces that kind of dangerous populism into the DNA of American politics. And there's a certain amount, as you say, he was a warrior, so you can call it a kind of Caesarism, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's a tribune of the people kind of guy. And you also get, just in terms of history rhyming, the three presidents who are most committed to the idea of this idea that since the president is the only politician elected by all of the people, he has a special mandate that gives him carte blanche to have his will enacted. And those three people are Andrew Jackson, Woodrow Wilson, and Donald J. Trump. And I disagree with that. The word mandate does not appear in the Constitution. Every senator who's elected to oppose the president has just as much of a mandate to do their job as the president has to do his or her. Because I'm a Madisonian, right? I think the conflict is good, not bad. And Jackson represents this trend in American politics that says, this nationalistic trend that says, this tribune of the people represents the people. So if you're in his way, you're betraying the people, you're betraying the nation. And I don't like that kind of politics. I think that kind of politics is dangerous. I think disagreement is good. And Jackson is the guy, I think, more than any other, who really introduces that strain into American politics, which is why it's so ironic that his vice president is Martin Van Buren, who really is not that guy.
No.
But he is, like Max Weber talks about the bureaucratization of charisma.
Mm-hmm.
You have charismatic figures, Joan of Arc, Jesus, Muhammad, whoever, and then the people who follow up actually turn it into, like Paul in Christianity, turn the passion of the charismatic relationship into rules, rights, procedures, institutions, organizations. And that feels to me the relationship of Martin Van Buren to Andrew Jackson, is that he translates the passion of Jackson into party politics in a lot of ways.
Van Buren, to some degree, knew he was cutting a deal with the devil by getting behind. I want to go back for just a moment now. When Andrew Jackson emerges as a national political candidate for president in the early 1820s, most of the Republican establishment at that time, and the different Republican Party, obviously, it's not the GOP that was started in the 1850s,
right?
But the Jeffersonians, they were very uncomfortable with him. Jefferson and Madison both couldn't stand him. And they were really worried about this idea of a military man, a trigger-happy military man who was known to go it alone, represented everything that they were against. And Van Buren was against him. His guy in 1824 was this now very obscure politician named William H. Crawford. But he was the guy the Jeffersonians were really behind, because he was a longtime cabinet member. He was Secretary of the War, Secretary of the Treasury. He was a diplomat. He was a senator. He was the kind of seasoned politician that they liked, who they thought could represent more of a consensus view of politics. And Jackson was they didn't even know what he stood for, really. He was never anybody with a clear political ideology. He was all over the map on tariffs. He was all over the map on internal improvements and what the federal government's role should be on internal improvements. And Crawford was very much more of a strong ideological man. But Van Buren realizes something, that after the 1824 election, when he says, all right, we're going to get behind Jackson now. And he goes down south and he gets other Southerners to put aside their opposition to him and says to him, look, John Quincy Adams is impossible. He's never going to represent us. Jackson is our guy. We can probably find a way to cool down the positions that we don't like very much, which has probably come about from too much exposure to military life. He's trying to make the case that he was much more of our kind of guy in the 1790s when he briefly served in the House and the Senate. So, and Van Buren realizes that Jackson is a problematic figure to build a party around, because in many ways, this populism that you allude to is something that they're very uncomfortable with as well. And a lot of this really comes out with his ideas about the economy, which is very much based on his just strong emotional prejudices against bankers, against paper money. He instituted an executive order, because he couldn't get the legislation passed through Congress, called the Specie Circular, which was this idea that if you want to buy any federal lands, you cannot do it with paper money. You have to do it with specie. So he really wanted to promote using specie, using hard money, as opposed to paper money, which he saw as this great inflationary scourge brought about by northern bankers and quick buck artists, that was having this deleterious effect on the U.S. economy. So Jackson has this whole economic vision of destroying the Bank of the United States, destroying the system of paper money that was being used, changing the whole market economy and how transactions were conducted. And all of this explodes on Martin Van Buren, who was never in favor of these things to begin with, when he becomes president. So this further speaks to this mixed legacy of Jackson, was this idea that, sure, he promoted policies that people emotionally, viscerally connected with, but were they good policies in the long run? Many of them were not.
Yeah, and so it's interesting. Normally, biographies of presidents kind of focus on their presidency, but you spent a lot of time on the post-presidency of Martin Van Buren, and I had a request from a friend. So, you got to ask him about the free soil stuff of 1848. So why don't we If we've missed anything from his actual presidency that you think is vital that we talk about, we can start with that. But then tell me how his post-presidency went.
He has a very unhappy 4 years as president of the United States. There were some successes there, especially in the field of foreign policy. But his time in office is marked by a devastating economic recession that they called panics. They were all called panics back then because there actually was some rioting in the streets. This was called the Panic of 1837. It all had to do with this sort of complicated network of English bankers who were financing a lot of American industry, mostly in cotton. There was a rise in the interest rate. The Bank of England, which had this big repercussion. British bankers called in their loans, withdrew their funding of American businesses. All of this kind of exploded during Van Buren's right when he started his presidency, and he was never quite able to get out from this. And the new political party at the time, the Whig Party, the party of Henry Clay, they took a page out of the Democrats' book, and they had a boisterous campaign in 1840. Was old war general William Henry Harrison, John Tyler. You all know about Tippecanoe and Tyler too. They had this amazingly successful presidential campaign in 1840. Van Buren is routed. He expects to retire from politics at the time, but Harrison dies 1 month into his presidency. John Tyler is the new president. He's unpopular with all the parties. And the 1844 election is up in the air, and Van Buren looks like a certainty to become the Democratic nominee in 1844. There's no one even running at the time, really. But then his opponents sort of corner him into taking a stand on this explosive issue of Texas. Now, Texas at the time it's really its own nation. It's a breakaway republic from Mexico. And there are a lot of Democrats in the South and the West who, of course, want to see Texas, which is a slaveholding society, join the Union. The people of Texas, which has a large American-born population at the time, they want to become part of the United States. But Van Buren is very uneasy about this, and he says there might be a time when Texas should join America, but not right now. This is too explosive an issue, the idea of bringing a large slaveholding society into the United States. And once he takes this public stand on Texas, his support within the Democratic Party, especially, of course, in the South and the West, really plummets. And he loses the Democratic nomination at the convention in Baltimore in May of 1844 to James K. Polk, who's much more in line with the Southern Democrats on his view of economic nationalistic expansion. So he loses. He's very bitter about the way he lost because he is someone who had cut a lot of deals with the slave power throughout his years in Washington because he was looked at with suspicion for being a Northerner, for being a New Yorker. And he always felt like he had gone out of his way to placate them, to say, we're against slavery here in the North, but we will not interfere with it down in the South. And a lot of his old friends turned on him because he didn't come out for the immediate annexation of Texas because he said, not right now. There was a big backlash now against all of this, and the Democratic Party starts to split into a new faction, and all of this comes to the fore over the Mexican War. Polk takes the nation to war over Mexico. It's a spectacular victory for the United States. We acquire California, Colorado, basically the entire western half of the United States is acquired as a result. So this issue comes up as, are we going to allow slavery in this territory? And a little-known congressman from northern Pennsylvania named David Wilmot introduces an amendment to an appropriation request that James Polk wants to negotiate a settlement with Mexico. He says any territory acquired as a result of the Mexican War will not have slavery in it. This sets off a whole new round of infighting in American politics at the time, especially in the Democratic Party. And a new faction emerges, and they're called the Free Soil Party. And again, the party has a simple motto: whatever territory is acquired from the Mexican War will not have any slavery there. But it's more than that, though. It's showing this. It rejuvenates a little bit of an idealistic side in the early Democratic Party that had long been subsumed to slavery, to westward expansion. Sort of trying to recapture some of those Jeffersonian roots in the Democratic Party that they felt had been lost over the years because in this kind of war fever that James Polk brought to the Democratic Party. At first, Van Buren wants nothing to do with this because he feels like, I'm retired from politics. Other people should be taking the lead on this. But he's got a son, John Van Buren, who's passionate about the Free Soil Party. They convince Van Buren, after a lot of finagling, to get him to run for president in 1848 because the Democratic politician native was a guy named Lewis Cass, who is even more fervent than James Polk on this issue of westward expansion. So this is this new chapter in Van Buren's life. Now, the Free Soil Party at the point is not an abolitionist party, but there are abolitionists within the party. Right. The Abolitionist Party is the Liberty Party. They join forces with the Free Soil Party, but there are a lot of Free Soil Party people who say, they use a lot of this language about, we're not here to fight against, to abolish slavery altogether. We just don't want to see, we can't compete with an enslaved workforce out in the West. We have to preserve Western lands for white frontiersmen. So they use a lot of this racist language that I think current historians have looked back on and say, a lot of this talk is very ugly, but I think people are missing out that this was an important development in American politics because for the first time, anti-slavery ideology really became a prominent feature in America's party wars, which had always been kind of a fringe issue at the time. So I think Van Buren does deserve some credit for using his name behind the Free Soil Party that I think sort of sets off a chain of events leading to the emergence of the Republican Party, which is a more explicitly anti-slavery party, and bringing about the eventual abolition that happened after the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. I think they're all connected, these things.
So I shamefully need to back up because I've probably mentioned Martin Van Buren's name more times in the last 45 minutes than I had in the preceding many years. But with the exception of George Costanza and Seinfeld and his conflicts with the Van Buren boys.
No, let me correct you. That's Kramer.
Oh, that's true. It's Kramer. That's Kramer. Although George then has a protege who ends up joining the Van Buren boys. So it's complicated. Like all history, it's complicated. But where was I going to go? Oh, so the time I most in the normal course of normal punditry, I bring up Van Buren is I have been a great skeptic about for 25 years but it's salient again, of the idea that sitting vice presidents have a special inside track to become president. It is useful as a statistical matter to have been vice president, but I always point out that since, what was it, the 12th Amendment, where the vice president and president aren't on the same ticket. So that's 1804. Since 1804, only two people have been elected, not, bequeathed through assassination. Only two sitting vice presidents have ever been elected to be president of the United States. One was George H.W. Bush, who had some advantages going on. The people wanted a third Reagan term, and he was blessed by the gods to run against Michael Dukakis. And the other one was Martin Van Buren. And Martin Van Buren was sort of, for years, I had not looked into the actual circumstances of Van Buren, of that race. Like, in some ways, it bolsters my point even more insofar as he had like 4 or 5 Whig opponents in his race. It's always nice when the other party has like almost a half dozen nominees to run against, and you're the heir of a populist president. So, like, Um, can we just explain how it is that he had this incredibly divided general election field?
Yeah.
And how much of it was people just saying we want another Andrew Jackson term?
The Whig Party, we have to remember, was still a very new force in American politics. They were there, but they just didn't have the name. In 1832, Henry Clay runs against Andrew Jackson. At the time, they're called National Republicans. So it's the idea of you're a Republican, but you're not as dedicated to states' rights ideology that Andrew Jackson. So in essentially we have the Jackson Party, which of course is Jackson and Van Buren, Calhoun, and you've got the National Republicans, which is more Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, to a lesser degree John Quincy Adams. Clay is around in 1832, but he experienced a bit of a rejuvenation because there's controversy about, again, Jackson's handling of the economy and destroying the Bank of the United States and taking those federal deposits and putting them in their own special banks. So Clay sees this kind of rejuvenation in his political career. He forms his own party. So he adopts this term, which was a big term during the Revolution, the Whig Party, the party that was against excessive executive power. It looks like Clay is going to run again in 1836, but he has a terrible personal loss. His daughter dies. I think 7 out of his 10 children died before he does. I think he lost all his daughters. He was an emotional wreck. He can't run for president. So the Whig Party, which is still trying to sort of formulate, trying to get its act together, trying to really sort of compete with the Democrats on the national level, is splintered. And most people like this idea of getting behind William Henry Harrison, who is never a popular national figure, but they see him as someone who was a war hero from the War of 1812, even though that was a while ago. So they're trying to take a page out of the Andrew Jackson book. They're trying to use that kind of frontier populism war hero that worked for Jackson and trying to bring it to William Henry Harrison. But a lot of people are uncomfortable with this. So you've got another candidate who's running, a guy named Hugh Lawson White, who's from Tennessee. So people in the South like Hugh Lawson White, senator from Tennessee. People from the West and much of the North like William Henry Harrison. But then there's Daniel Webster. He hasn't quite given up. He's on the ballot in Massachusetts. South Carolina, which is the one holdout state still awarding its electoral votes through its legislature. They don't like any of the candidates. So you've got this extremely divided Whig Party running for office where it's almost impossible that they could get a majority of electoral votes. But there's also the possibility that this could go to the House of Representatives again, because they fear no one's going to get a majority. Henry Clay, who of course was associated with the 1824 election, is now associated with the prospect of another House election in 1836. So this all works again. Everything is going wrong for the Whigs in 1836. And at the same time, you've got the same way I think George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, in Reagan's third term, everyone sees Martin Van Buren as continuity. That the man who not only helped elect Jackson president, but was his Secretary of State, later his vice president, is somebody who would really carry on a lot of Jackson's policies, which even though a lot of them were controversial in parts of the country and unpopular, still they liked Jackson. They liked what he represented. He was still this powerful figure, had a real hold on the American imagination, and was the face of the Democratic Party. And Van Buren was the man so much responsible for him that he was naturally going to be the favorite in 1836, and he was.
So in the time we got left, how, like, your biography of Martin Van Buren is the first in what, 4 decades?
Yep.
And it was
the first comprehend. There have been shorter books written, and there's been books written about various aspects of his career, but
right.
How
come? Like, let's say when you were thinking about doing this and you talk to your, elbow patched, plaid wearing historian friends about doing this. What was their reaction? Martin Van Buren.
Yeah.
Like what was the historical consensus about Van Buren, and why do you think it was necessary to do this?
Well, I remember when I got one publisher turned me down. I think what the editor said to me was, "We don't do mutton chops." When I was,
We should note he had some of the more impressive sideburns in American history.
no doubt. He was an unsuccessful president, and because he was an unsuccessful president, he is lumped into this category of colorless, antebellum, one-term presidents who failed to halt the nation's descent into civil war. He is called about the worst thing you could be called in politics: average.
Mm-hmm.
If you were great, obviously people want to know why you were great. And if you were spectacularly bad, and some level people want to know why you were spectacularly bad. But to be called average just makes it sound like this was a dull and uneventful period in U.S. history, which it very much wasn't. So I tried to make the argument that, yes, the story of his life is much more than his presidency. But, you think of other unsuccessful one-term presidents. You think of maybe John Quincy Adams, or even more contemporary, someone like Herbert Hoover. You could at least say, okay, John Quincy Adams fought a valiant fight against slavery in Congress in the 1830s and 40s. Herbert Hoover led this great fight against world hunger. So there's aspects of it that it's easier for people to understand. But when you talk about Martin Van Buren, but talking about the guy who invented the party system, that's a tougher sell, because people think, well, what's so great about the party system to begin with? And it just doesn't have this kind of a glamour that fighting slavery, tackling world hunger, like Jimmy Carter, or like Herbert Hoover, or Grant had an unsuccessful presidency, but of course he was a war hero. So Van Buren has none of those qualities. So it's a tougher sell. And there is this perception out there that presidents between Jackson and Lincoln were quote unquote weak. There were some terrible presidents in there. I'm not going to deny that. But Van Buren's story is a fascinating story. And I try to tell it in this book in a way that it's never been told before, about changing mores in American politics, how he represented that, and how he created the political playbook for how to win elections that I think we're still using in many, many ways. Now, there are enormous differences in the way elections are done now. The biggest role of changes in how we raise money and communicate. But the basic idea is something that I think Martin Van Buren's life is still being used in many levels.
Not to drag you into 21st century political controversy, but part of my thesis, and I'm not alone in this, I'm a part of one would call a faction, who think that the problem with our parties today is that they're too weak, not that they're too strong. That one of the reasons you get really strong partisanship is that part of the function of parties is to have an editing function, to think about the long-term interests of the party, of the coalition that it represents, of thinking about what it stands for beyond a single election, and basically that they've become, partly because of the primary system and some campaign finance reforms that have taken the ability to control the purse strings of elections away from the parties, that you now have a lot of institutions that are doing more party work than the parties themselves. Voter mobilization, voter education, that kind of thing. And part of the genius of, I would argue, of Martin Van Buren's, when I talk to college kids about why parties are good or can be good, part of the point I'll make is, I'll go back to Madison a lot, but is that what parties do is they provide functionality to coalitions. And so you can say, I always say, look, you have, in 19th century West, you had ranchers and farmers. They had real disagreements, water rights, property rights, right of way, for blah, 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 blah. But you know what? They had more in common with each other than they had in common with the East Coast banks and the railroads. And so they would form a coalition that says, if you work with us, we'll work with you. We can get 70% of what we want. But if the other coalition wins, we get zero. And so it forces compromise on members of the coalitions in important ways that create a coherent program and that impose discipline on politicians. And I think with the primaries, campaign finance reform, the rise of social media, the incentives to be a good party member disappear. And instead, it's much more of a Jacksonian thing. It's like, we're with the big man in terms of Donald Trump or whoever. And I'm wondering what you think, what you think, but also what do you think Martin Van Buren would think about what has happened to the party system since he kind of came up with it? Do you think he would have been in favor of all of the various reforms to the parties? Are you in favor of the reforms to the parties? Are there ways to sort of get closer to the ideal that Van Buren had in mind with reforms that maybe undemocratize aspects of it? How do you think about modern parties? Because you're talking about how there's continuity with the stuff that Martin Van Buren introduced.
Mm-hmm.
There's also disconnect. What do you think of the disconnects, and what do you think of the continuities?
The party system is weakened these days in terms of, I think, connection with a lot of voters. I think that is true. But there is a level of loyalty, I think, especially in today's Republican Party, that I've never seen before. I can't say that I'm an expert on the entire history of party politics in America, but I know enough where I've never seen a party where there is so much devotion to a president the way the Republican Party is to Donald Trump right now. So in this sense, I think Van Buren would tip his hat to Trump and say, I don't know how you pulled this off. I would have liked to have had this level of admiration among Democrats when I was in office. In Van Buren's time, there was a pro-slavery wing of the Democratic Party. There was an anti-slavery wing of the Democratic Party. The opposition, the Whig Party, they had a pro-slavery wing and they had an anti-slavery wing. And I think throughout this issue of race in American politics, the Democrats and the Republicans in the 20th century, up until the 1970s, they did have their pro-civil rights factions and their anti-civil rights factions, and Republicans and Democrats. You know all about the Dixiecrats. You know all about Northern Republicans like Nelson Rockefeller and Lowell Weicker, and you had a black senator from Massachusetts, Edward Brooke, I think his name was. So you had the strong factions within these parties over this issue of race and civil rights. That's largely gone now. I don't think this is a great thing for American politics at all. This issue of compromise that we've talked about a bit this morning, it works both ways. You do need compromise in a nation as big and disparate as ours. At the same time, this move toward consensus and compromise can crowd out important voices in our dialogue that can have repercussions down the road in ways that are not always helpful. Let's put it that way. So would we be better off for the European type system, which was not all about two parties, but multiple parties forming coalitions with those parties, the way they do in Great Britain, for example? Well, personally, I think so. I would like that. I don't know how you feel about that, but I think the rigidity of our two-party system right now does, to some extent, undermine democracy. I don't see any way out of it at the moment, because there's still going to be this tendency come election time for people to either vote for Democrats or Republicans. The Libertarian Party, the Green Party, they're going to remain fringe elements in our parties for a while. Will we ever reach that day where we have a more European-type system, parliamentary democracy? I don't know. But it's certainly something I think we should think about as a country right now, given the state that we're in.
Yeah, I mean, this is another one of these things where I'm not particularly enamored of parliamentary democracy, but I would rather live in a parliamentary democracy where the rules of a parliamentary democracy than to live in a country where people vote as if we live in a parliamentary democracy and we don't, right? You have these people who think we just have to vote for the party. And it doesn't really matter about the quality of the candidate. That is a very parliamentary way of thinking about things. There's nothing inherently wrong with that system,
Yeah.
but it's a really stupid way to vote in a country that actually doesn't have a parliamentary democracy, a parliamentary constitutional order. And but this is one of these things I am still flummoxed about, how the founders did not foresee that, as well as they should have it, let's say, that a two-party system of some sort was inevitable by the nature of the Constitution's design. When it's first past the post, right, winner take all, it lowers the incentive to have more than one party, because it's the Richard Hofstadter thing about how third parties are like bees; they have their effect by stinging and then they die. Right? The to have multiple party system here means that the party that you are, if you're a minor party, the party that you most agree with is the one you're going to hurt the most by stealing its votes away. That's the Teddy Roosevelt example. That's the Ross Perot example. And so I think you have to change the Constitution if you're going to go for a parliamentary system. I personally, and my listeners know this very well from me, but I personally think I'm much more with the political scientists of the 1950s, the E. Schachtschneider and Nelson Polsby crowd and all those kinds of people who argued that democracy is what you have between the parties, not within the parties. And I think that the primary system, combined with social media and some of these other things, has made it possible to hijack the parties with demagoguery, which is why I think Andrew Jackson would do very well today. And I'm a believer in gatekeepers. I'm a small R Republican, and I feel like I would like to think that Martin Van Buren would look at how we run these things and say, this is no way to run a railroad, but what do I know?
No, I very much agree with you on that.
All right, so just as a purely selfish question, then I will let you go. I've been doing a bit of a deep dive in recent years on the revolutions of 1848 in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm always, and it's rare I get to run into somebody who might actually know something about that period. Admittedly, Van Buren was sort of an elder statesman at the time, but how much spillover was there, in your opinion? How much did there's this whole generation of refugees that come from Europe. They were called the 48ers, and they were considered liberals or even radicals in Europe, and then they come to America, and a lot of them start calling themselves conservatives because all of a sudden the things that they were fighting for over there are essentially birthrights here.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very difficult to find a lot of. I mean, I've been looking. There's some. We don't. It's a whole other podcast to do. But like, was the Revolution of 1848 something that you found entered the political discourse much, or is it just sort of a side issue?
I was surprised when I was writing about the Free Soil Party in 1848 when Van Buren announces his support for the Free Soil Party, along with his son, John Van Buren, and future Democratic nominee for president in 1876, Samuel Jones Tilden. They write something called the Barn Burner Manifesto. And Van Buren, the section that he wrote, makes a lot of references to what's going on in Europe in 1848 and how it's an inspiration to America that what this nation went through in the 18th century is something that had this repercussions in Europe. And he saw Europe as sort of something we should be looking to right now, which is something he never would have said in the 1820s and 1830s. John Quincy Adams said we should be looking to Europe because he liked a lot of their more nationalistic economic programs. And they really used this to hang him in the 1820s, this idea of we don't look to Europe for guidance. We're Americans. We built our own systems, our own institutions here. And Van Buren in 1848 says this whole battle between labor and capital is what they're fighting over in Europe right now. And we have lost sight of the role of labor in American life. We've been too friendly with the forces of capital. So this was his last hurrah in politics, 1848, but it did have that spillover effect, and it's something that did affect him.
That's great. I'm going to look up the Barn Burner Manifesto.
It's a scintillating read, let me tell you.
All right, sir. Thank you so much for doing this. James Bradley is the author of Martin Van Buren, America's First Politician. And for listeners who put such a high stock in Yuval Levin's opinion, he absolutely loved this book and was very, very excited that I was going to have James Bradley on. I purchased it just a few days ago because I've been crazy busy and I've already started reading it, and it's great. A lot of great reviews, and for American history buffs, highly recommend it.